Guys, we are back with Brian Foley, and we are talking everything about the muscle up today. This is going to be a really fun conversation, I think, because we're going to try to break it down in maybe some different ways that you haven't seen before. I have to tell you, if Brian does do a little bit of coughing, there are literally forest fires going on in California right now, so he's got a little smoke in the pipes. Otherwise, I think we'll be pretty good. But Brian, welcome on, man. I appreciate you coming on. What's new in your world right now?
It's new in my world. Heading out to Arizona soon. So exciting stuff. I was originally out there for the last few years, been out in California. And then as of today, it looks like we could get out there by the end of September. So get to headquarters for Big Dawgs and OPEX. And
I love it, man. That's going to be so good.
yeah, so I'm excited for that. It's the exciting piece in my life right now.
I love it. Awesome. Okay, well, let's get into the muscle up, and I've got some questions that I've given to Brian already, so he's ready to rock and roll on this thing. Let me open the conversation by just, if somebody either doesn't know it or if they can't visualize it, what, Brian, is a muscle up?
Yeah, so a muscle up is a combination of a radial pull-up into a dip. And at the end of that dip, you end in a full support position. And you can accomplish these either on a set of gymnastics rings or your stand-up pull-up bar.
Okay, and when you say radial pull-up, what does that mean? So essentially you start below the rings, you end above the rings. But what does radial mean?
So radial, using that term, is think of circular, right? So we're going in a circular motion rather than up and down. People think you can do pull-ups and do it in a kipping manner, dynamic manner, and it's not an up and down movement. It's a side to side, right? So thinking about in radial terms, you are sweeping around these objects, right? So.
Got it. That is one of the better explanations I've ever heard for that. So I appreciate you telling me that. I learned something new every time I talk to you guys.
Awesome.
Second question, why are muscle ups challenging for people? And I'd love to dig into this one a little bit. So why do you find muscle ups are challenging for folks?
I think to sum it up for most, it's that the muscle ups require an advanced amount of coordination through space. Right. So if you don't have good spatial awareness or proprioception as a human being or an athlete in general, it's going to be very hard for you to understand how to change your body positions from a pull up into a dip and pressing out. And then after that entire motion, reverse patterning that so that you can continue and maintain tension and create these strings of sets.
When you say create tension, what does that mean?
So tension on the ring, you are not going to be able to do anything against these rings or a bar unless you're creating tension, right? So I like to create tension for athletes, have them hop on a set of rings, and then I want them to bounce on those rings, keep it in a long, tight, hollow body, and you can feel a snap, and you get that tension when you know, and you can feel that buoyancy on these pieces of equipment, whether that be a ring or a bar. You can now feel and go, okay, it gives you kind of this sense of awareness of, I can understand how swinging is going to come into play and how I need to stay long and tight as I keep these straps, if I'm on rings, taut.
Gotcha. Okay, so technique is challenging, spatial awareness is challenging. How about strength? I mean, and I know that we're talking about it more in a kipping or a swinging fashion, but how much strength do you have to do a muscle up even in a swinging fashion?
Yeah, strength-wise, a requirement or base, if you were to get into swinging or dynamic, you would have to have a strict muscle up to begin with that, right? So you would start with pushing and pulling capacities, right? Can you do strict pull-ups? That would be a level 1 assessment to look at. And if you can do 8 to 10 reps, I think that's a good marker, at least 5 as a base, to say, okay, you have some strength to pull, right? And then you want to look at a pushing movement, whether that be handstand push-ups. And though we're using a dip in the ring muscle up, you can use many markers. So for the sake of this, we could say a strict dip, right? And say they could do 5. I would take those 2 markers and go, okay, I'm confident. Let's see if you have the skills to get yourself and pull yourself up on top of these bad boys.
So just to confirm, you're saying people should be able to do 5 proper strict pull-ups and 5 proper strict dips before even attempting to do muscle ups, at least correctly. Is that fair?
For sure, because you got to show tension in there and control, right? Because those are the 2 foundational pieces in that movement, and then you're not even talking about the transitions.
Yeah,
right?
I am clearly trying to get you to say that way too many people who are not strong enough are trying to do muscle ups. So
Totally.
I'll just I'll get right down to it. I just think that that's so important for everybody to think through, right? Like people are saying, oh, why can't I do a muscle up? Or maybe more interestingly, why can't I do 3 muscle ups? You know, it's like you can do a horrible muscle up if you luck out on a hip dip or a hip kip, right? Like you just never know. It's like it's the person in the CrossFit class that just like miraculously gets over the ring somehow, and then you're like, hey, go again, and they get halfway to the rings on rep number 2. So you got to have technique, and then you have to have strength and control. How about when you start doing a lot more reps? How challenging is muscle endurance in higher rep sets of muscle ups? Is that something that limits folks?
Yeah, I think with muscle endurance, I think it comes down to their skill, right, and then efficiency. And the more efficient, and I like to use the word buoyant when you're on the rings, because when you get in that flow and you're doing multiple repetitions, you're essentially bouncing off the bottom, you're bouncing off the top, and it's a very cool flow to feel, right? So when you have that technique and efficiency in place, endurance is not as hard to accomplish, but it's when you have, let's say, an over-strong athlete, right? They have a massive amount of strength and required to do there, and they could probably just stand there and pull themselves over the rings, right? And they can just do these. What you'll find is that their brains are going to use muscles before technique, right? So depending on how that athlete's brain ticks, it will limit them if they're a muscle puller, right? And then secondly, if they're not efficient, that could be also another limitation.
Interesting. Okay, so this is a tough question when we're not actually demoing muscle ups, but what sort of technique do you find is generally most effective for fitness athletes to do muscle ups?
Are we talking like one skill technique to use?
Yes. Yep. I can see you just visualizing the whole thing in your head.
I'm actually bouncing around in the gym in my head right now. Like, I got a bar, I got a rings. What am I doing? Yeah, I think beat swings and segmenting beat swings is a great drill, and goes back to the beginning of our conversation about the tension piece. If you can create tension, you can create whip and snap.
Okay.
Right. So tension's the base. So just imagine very slow swinging, hollow body, hollow arching. You can show tension and your whole body's connected. Graduate to higher swings, right? And then when you can get a big back swing, and I actually coach the back swing more than the front swing. I really don't give a lot of cues on there. I make athletes exaggerate their backswing because I find that that's the biggest limitation in athletes not knowing or thinking they have the capability to almost go parallel to the ground with their face facing down on that backswing to allow them to have that tension and then the whip and the snap over top.
Yeah, it's physics at that point, right? If you stay tight on the rings, you have more distance with a long lever arm in your legs and feet, right? To create speed. And then if you can time it, then the hip is the piece that really snaps you over. Is that accurate?
Yep.
Okay.
Beautiful.
And then like I often hear so many people say things like, get your head through the window or whatever. Like, how do you help people who maybe struggle a little bit to make the transition from getting high enough on the rings to then transitioning through the rings into the dip position?
Yeah, so this is a good one. I back 2012, 13, when I was doing group class instruction, I had to be super efficient to get people to understand that component. And I used the hip snap and the kip as my first cues in how to coach people. And I told them to imagine, okay, you're on these rings. I want you to get your hips like you're pole vaulting and you're getting them over a bar. And then you have to miss that bar as you come through on top of those rings, right? And when you teach that and people can snap and you show that there's the tension there, from there, you just say, you got to tell them just to whip as fast as they can. So if their hips get up and they're opened up, all they have to do here, because they're high enough, is just change the angle of their body and they're over. And then they're in that bottom support position where they can kip right back out and lean back into that reverse recliner.
What What I found a lot when I was teaching this same idea in group classes is the people who could get high enough but still struggled to come through, one of two things generally happened. Either their feet stayed too high, and so there's no physical way to close the window. The best person in the world that I've ever seen closing the window with high feet is Amanda Goodman. She basically does like a V up at the top of a muscle up. The second one, though, are people whose hands are too tight. And so when they try to pull through the rings, their hands get caught and they can't actually get their elbow up over their hands. That was a big one for folks. And it's like, I get it, right? You're up on the rings 8-10 feet above the ground. So it makes sense. Okay, cool. I wish we could talk about that forever because I love talking about that. But let's say somebody has a muscle up. Okay, they understand how to do it. You like the technique that they can do one muscle up with. How do you help them improve a max set? So let's not call it 1 to 5. Let's call it like they got 3 or 4, right? How do you help them go to 10, like a fairly big jump? What are some of the things they need to do to go from 3 to 10?
Yeah, so 3 to 10, if we're going to take just the skill itself, right? And there's nothing around else in this program. What they would go through is we'll just say a stable number would be 5 is their max. So a technique I like to use is get the max. Get the max at the front of the week, and you're testing the skill, and they get 5. What I like to do is take 50% of that and give them that in EMOM format for 5 minutes and see how they do. And I'm very confident within gymnastics in general, but muscle up specifically, whatever max you have, you start at 50% of that and you keep working your sets up until you punch that ceiling and break through. So I like density up before I keep having them have attempts to reach that ceiling and overreach into 6 into 7. But I would take that EMOM format, and every session they get more minutes until they show some physical breakdown. And what I do at that point is I'll count the total repetitions. Say they're accumulating almost 30 in a week. I will give them different progressive sets now. So now that I know they have 5, I'm going to say, okay, you're going to do you're going to do 3x3, 2x2s, 1x1s, perfect, rest is needed. And then I'll mix it up the next session and be like, all right, you're going to do a set of 4, rest is needed, and then 3 reps by 5 sets, rest is needed, perfect. And then you can sneak in a max AMRAP set and you hope to get that 6, and then you can reverse this whole process again. Now you're starting at 3.
Got it. So are you essentially saying, from a principled standpoint, that you believe that a single set worth of max muscle ups is actually built through volume of submaximal sets?
Yes. Okay.
And so as you build up more reps sub-max, the max should go up.
Yes, but I want to ensure that you're checking in on that endurance side of things, whether that be once or twice a week, where you're giving them a chance to say, okay, where does that max sit right now?
Gotcha.
And as long as you have a marker and you see that going, I would do tons and tons of volume, because at that point, the athlete has done so many freaking muscle ups that first time they did 5, when they get into the fatigue state, they're like, dude, I just did like 60 for the last 3 weeks. Like, let's go. This is like cake. Come on. And I think it's more of the psychological component. You get so confident because it becomes a natural skill for you, right? Like double unders. And you do them so much to where, you walk in and you can now hit unbroken sets without even thinking. And that's the point where I want muscle ups to get to, because then you don't think about mechanics. You think about, all right, where's my fatigue meter? And then how can I push that and how can I work underneath it?
Gotcha. Okay. Next question, sort of same idea of endurance, except let's talk a little bit about putting muscle ups into different workouts. So where a lot of people seem to fail is when they do other pieces either prior to or with the muscle up and then jump up to the rings and try to do reps. So A, what is that? Like, why do they just fail all of a sudden? And B, how can they improve it?
Yeah, so if athletes are dealing with that, it's because they didn't progress the skill through different phases of training, right? So you and I have only been talking about the skill by itself in a non-fatigue manner. Now, from there, you have to have structure and build that into these mixed modal settings. And so from there, you would add a cyclical piece secondarily. From when you go from a non-fatigue, I add cyclical pieces. And now what I do is I train them with elevated breath rate. Not a ton, but just give them a variable, right? And then you watch adaptation, and athletes can go and excel through these stages where all of a sudden you're doing complementary movements with muscle ups, then you're doing non-complementary movements with muscle ups, and you're working in these phases until they can show complete control no matter what the scenario is. They know what they can do as far as capacity sits, and they can break that down into functional working sets for themselves in work.
So I want to try to re-say this in examples just so that I'm clear and everybody else is clear. When you say non-fatigue, you're talking, sets of 2 or 3 if their max is 5, multiple EMOM sets because they're not actually fully fatiguing out in an endurance way. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. When you add a cyclical component, that might look like something like a salt bike into muscle ups. To start adding breathing prior to doing the movement so that you can do the movement a little bit fatigued. When you then say complementary, maybe it's like lunges with no weight into a muscle up because it's a movement that's not directly hurting the muscle up, meaning it's not like an upper pull, upper push. Okay, and then when you say non-complementary, that might look like, I don't know, burpees and like rowing into a muscle up because those movements are quote unquote harming the muscle up. Is that safe to say?
Yes.
Okay. And they have to show proficiency and success in each of those stages prior to expecting to be able to do a highly fatigued workout and get muscle ups.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. I think that is something that everybody in the world should pay attention to. Because I think a lot of people believe that once they learn the skill, they should be able to do it whenever they want. And I think that that's something that just goes unnoticed by folks. Okay.
In the face, that's all you think.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay, so I would love if you could just kind of end with maybe 1 or 2 examples of one example of somebody who couldn't seem to improve their muscle up and why. Whether they listen to you or not, so you can take that however you want. And then an example of somebody who was able to improve their muscle up fairly rapidly. How did those 2 things happen?
And is this in a coaching scenario of myself with an athlete?
Yeah, somebody that you saw. They just, for whatever reason, they weren't improving, whether they followed a program or not, right? But like, what are the reasons that you see somebody not improving? And then what are the reasons you see people improving?
And we go back to just what we're talking about. They fast tracked at some point, someone that can't progress. They fast tracked and they think they're here and they're not. There's no base of support that they built leading in to say, oh, you can actually do a bunch of these and expect to actually excel, where someone who is excelling typically has experience and has accumulated volume right within their training, which allows them to express more. So I find those are 2 examples of polar opposite people. If you're stuck, go back in your training and look at that. And I'm going to ensure that you probably haven't been focusing on muscle ups at all, or very minimal in design. And then you come over to this person, at least they were touching the skills maybe twice a week, which allowed them to pick up on, whether they're coaching with me or I see that, they can pick up on what you're cueing them on is because they have experiences they time stamped and allows them to think while they're working through skill progressions.
Awesome. Brian, that's all the time we have today, but I really appreciate you coming on. I think this could be game-changing for a lot of folks. It's just a movement that we constantly hear people wanting to get and improve on, and also one that's a big limiter in competitions. So appreciate you coming on, sir. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.